This is Patrick's colleague. Would you like to introduce?
This is Shajay Booshan.
Yeah, this is a little bit too complicated.
Who has been working with us for how many years? 8 years?
6 years.
6 years, 6 years. And teaching with at the DRL as well. He was a student there. And is leading our kind of research department in terms of computational design, code. But has also been interested recently in like all of DRL, having this interaction between material form finding, material logics, processes,
okay, wait a minute. Don't start that again.
computational translations, and been leading some of a series of experimental installations. One of them, which thankfully, and I want to thank Eric and SCI-Arc for giving us the opportunity, is the latest version, is appearing a few meters back and just finished 2 minutes ago. A fragment you can see here. So
I thought it actually wasn't finished, and we were bringing him here to dismiss him from Zaha Hadid Architects for not following the rules. It occurred to me, so what we typically do is go through and ask a few questions and try our best to not embarrass, but to obligate Patrik to account for things that he may be reluctant to account for, which we already figured out in the last 2 days is difficult to do. But we give it a shot. The first question was, and I walked in there about a half an hour ago, and there might be a question about whether it makes any difference whether it's finished or not anyway. So maybe you can tell us, does it matter if it's finished?
Well, it matters at least to the point that the props need to be taken out. Because these are not just shapes, they are kind of super light structures we're trying to do. Yeah. I mean, you can hold this whole shell on one hand. And it's nevertheless, the props are kind of gone. And so to that extent it's important. Of course, the piece is not finished with respect to original design intent. It was 5 fiberglass shells. One of them was projecting out in the center as a cantilever. Now we're left with 4. 2 of them have been executed as intended.
So the answer is it's not finished. It's not, but it doesn't matter.
But as a design, we had, it's like Jeff said last time, every project comes in on budget, even if it's the last budget in the iteration of budget. So it came in, it's finished according to the latest design. And the drawings and posters on the
You just have to ask for more money, and we increase the budget. No problem.
No, it's finished according to the latest design iteration.
Right. Well, the reason I asked the question, or one of the reasons I asked the question, is we've had a discussion in the last day or two about research and the meaning of research. And some of the most interesting exhibitions at SCI-Arc have fallen down. And which is not to say if everything falls down, you have a different problem, which means clearly you have no idea what you're doing. But if once in a while something would start to tip over, so it might suggest that what you're working on is not mastered. The rules aren't clear. And that would put it in a category that would be of some interest to us in an experimental way. And the question is whether this conforms to that idea, meaning are we building something that we know and understand, or are we doing something that we're learning about in the process of implementing it? Yeah.
Well, yes, I think these kind of experimental structures are at the same time an execution, because it's a first, is a learning process and an adjustment process, and to the extent that the final product is not exactly as intended, perhaps. And with the same we had with the Venice structure. In fact, we kind of were we kind of found out about the exact real behavior of these pleated superlight aluminum surfaces as they folded out, and we had to kind of adjust on the spot. And because that was a project which was slightly less predictable and beyond like this one, where I think in the sense we just didn't finish. The only surprise was it took much longer than we expected, and we couldn't complete the whole process. But it is, I think, an interesting process here, because this is a minimal surface which is a fabric, stretched fabric, producing the fiberglass surface, so it doesn't use a mold, similar like our Venice installation didn't use a mold. So we're trying to get away from just milling molds and out of huge polystyrene blocks and laying the forms, but there's a kind of form generation without molds, which also means there's a kind of material logic which helps materially compute the surface. And it was just talking to Josh from Bill Chrysler, who I thank for giving us the space and help. That, for instance, they're experts in composites, and it's the first time they have ever worked without molds and using the fabric to find the form in space around the frame, and then kind of with very kind of light touch layering the fiberglass, hardening and stiffening and
but in that
building up the form.
In
so
that sense, it might be more
research.
useful to see it as a chronology or as something in process, so you understand a little bit what you know, or you understand a little bit what you don't know and still have to learn. Meaning, back to the original question, maybe in this case, finishing it is not the objective, because it's not a one-off event. It's not a poem.
Absolutely. It's a whole series. It's a series, and in particular for Shajay, who's been and working with us, we've done the series of experiments and computational tools which have been developed. And in the parallel, we have generated a series of competitions I've been showing. And I showed you work from the Vienna students, from AADFL, from Innsbruck students, all feeding in, and Shajay being involved in some of those. So that's it's an iteration process and an ongoing process, clearly. For instance, I think it was quite nice, and Shajay did in China, this kind of generate the mesh out of circle packing of rings, which then in large scale creating, and then you can see as you stretch the fabric, you can see the tension and the distortion of the rings, and you can kind of start manipulating so it evens out. You have a visual representation of equalization of tension, and then for this project he found a kind of particular mesh, a power mesh, which is a kind of hexagonal mesh. But he had gone through the experience of the circle packing handmade mesh, which made it possible for him to select the kind of appropriate mesh when he came across it. So there's this kind of accumulation of knowledge and skill, and he's done these projects like this in Mexico and one in India, where he used fabric as geometric guide and to install a shape in space. And it's important to have not only the kind of computational models, the smaller physical model, but also these interim installation scales, which exist in schools of architecture, sometimes exist in the art space, as a kind of interim for us to formulate expertise and also bring in engineers. I mean, the one in Venice was beyond.
Okay, wait a minute,
yeah.
Because
okay.
we're getting.
Maybe I should hand over to Shajay to elaborate a little bit on that.
We're getting to that in 2 seconds. The way you talk about it in terms of a learning process related to a series of technical strategies. And the question in a broader sense is whether you think architecture literally is a didactic process, but not only either self-taught or with you guys working in your office. Meaning, last night we were talking about a different constituency. Don't build it and you talk to Kipnis, Wolf, so on and so on. Build it and you include a group of people who really are not part of this sort of insider yakety-yak. So the question is, if the project is intelligible or important, does it require that the audience who sees it understands what technical issues are at stake in the process? Meaning, if you brought in Hu Jintao, I said, oh, you guys are doing this, and I understand why it's important. In other words, is a technical reading. What the hell? Is that me or you? Me?
It's
you?
not me. It's not me. Yeah.
Call you back.
I got your question, and I think the answer is, in the final building, the process falls away,
Right.
and the non-expert general public audience or the particular users of the building only care about the performance of the building in terms of its social
We're getting to social, but I mean, I'm just talking about the reading of a technical...
No, it's not, it shouldn't, I don't believe, that's, I think, where I distinguish myself from Frampton's idea of the tectonic. It's not about the didactic of Frampton, Kenneth Frampton.
Who?
And others who fetishize or see the kind of factura and tectonic articulation as expressing the didactic of technical functionality, and I don't believe that. I think for
but you're talking about it that way.
In an expert discourse, I consider this audience to be an expert discourse. I consider this installation not to be a final product, but be part of an elaborate design research project and design process. The real product is hopefully what we're going to do. Well, we have one in Hyde Park, which is for the magazine, this kind of tensile structure we're doing there, or that some of the other shell projects I've been showing, whether it's the airport or the presidential palace in Algiers. There would be the final product. At that point, we can have an expert discourse about it, but for the general audience, it's more about, does it order social processes? Does it make social order legible?
Here's the reason I think the subject is important. We had a discussion. Patrik presented a whole series of what he called research projects. And so the term was used and used repeatedly to indicate some kind of inquiry. But what precipitated the inquiry and what its objectives were, or how one would understand it was successful or not successful, who was the constituency, meaning was it done internally for an office understanding, or was it done in order to make possible a different kind of, let's say, social or organizational? So really the question, which I think would be of interest to everyone, just to follow up on what you said on Wednesday, is when you say you're doing research, and a series of studies are research-driven, what is the research and how is the task defined? And I should add something else to it, as I might understand it, which I think is probably different than the way you understand it. If you send a curiosity to Mars, and you send it to Mars not in order to ratify what you already know, or that may be part of the process, but in order to discover something which is entirely outside of your frame of reference, meaning it might come back and ratify the argument that Mars is like the Grand Canyon, but it might come back and ratify a different set of facts empirically, meaning there's nothing like that on the Earth. It's a completely different question. So you have to be a little bit more precise when you talk about what the objectives are. You know what I mean? In the research, how the questions are defined and how you modify it as you. I think the curiosity is, you know, the thing that the Americans sent to Mars and is wheeling around. So research.
Well, the objectives in this case, and I want to hand over to Shajay in a minute to elaborate a little bit on this. I mean, just to say this much, the objective of this set of researches is an interim objective, not yet a final objective, for architecture's efficacy and congeniality with respect to the progress of civilization. That would be the final objective. How can architecture fulfill its societal function?
But this is a little bit too broad.
Well, and we break that down into increasing complexity within architecture. We break this down into diversifying architectural morphologies and articulatory registers. And then we identifying within that a kind of subset of interest, namely lightweight structures and shell structures as something, an arena where you can...
But what are you looking for? In other words, why is that a research topic? What's underneath that? I mean, if you say lightweight structures, you're talking about a technical issue, which... And you're leaving out the sociological argument, which I think we agree belongs to the broader audience. So I think you have to tell us if you can.
That's why you have to bring it down in higher. I said the overall final ambition is what is the societal function of architecture, how it is the kind of all about the social functionality, meaning how do you order and articulate social processes which on a new level of complexity, with a new level of communicative density, and that means you have to increase versatility and complexity in the built environment and in your repertoires. That includes the idea of expanding the repertoire through introducing gradients, continuous differentiation, fields instead of a series of cells, continuous differentiated fields. You have to kind of retalk the history of the last 15 years, and then you kind of it also poses kind of technical issues. It poses fabrication issues.
But let me try to pin you down on how specifically because you're talking about.
Let me finish the thought, then I can.
But I'm just afraid you're going to go back.
No. So that you see where I'm mediating from the societal function and societal challenges down, break it down when I'm reaching now geometric design issues, fabrication issues. But then I can concentrate on give that piece problematic to somebody or that exists already, and I already know that it's relevant for the overarching problem, but as I'm working on that sub-problem, I don't have to continuously think and justify the overarching problem. I know I've located the sub-problem, and now we can work on this. And maybe Shajay can
let me try one more time. Okay, listen to this, see if I can make sense out of this. There are broad sociological, philosophical, aesthetic, organizational objectives in architecture. Yeah. There's a little installation down the hall. What is the correlation between that and the broader questions? In other words, why are we talking about shell structures in anticipation, not that what you're saying generally is not fair enough, but how in particular, remember we were talking?
It's not particular.
Yeah. How in particular does it inform the bigger questions?
It contributes to the discourse of parametricism, and parametricism is the style and paradigm and heuristics which delivers new levels of complexity and complex order in the built environment. So it is a particular point, highly partial contribution to this overall trajectory, but it's sitting right at it is fully within that trajectory. There are hundreds other researchers which are in that trajectory. This is one of them. So you can't take the whole of the burden by itself in isolation, cannot carry the burden of delivering the kind of civilizatory progress, but it needs a series of mediating steps which I started to outline.
So let's not say that the broadest architectural objectives would be furthered in the broadest sense by the development of further work with thin shells. Let's say that but we could say some of those bigger objectives, because we're talking about, for instance, sociological or organizational questions. So how in particular would a study of that kind advance the discourse in terms of, let's say, an organizational strategy in a cultural sense? How would it do that?
For instance, it would do that instead of having boxes within boxes or boxes next to boxes. You have arrays and fields of shell which are swelling and shrinking and moving from creased to smooth to faceted, intersecting in a kind of bubble diagram or metaball fashion. So it's a formalism, a morphology, which has the capacity to deliver some of these.
But you're talking about gradients in a way.
Gradients,
but
morphings. That's what these shells are. The shells are not crisp platonic domes. They are kind of, they have degrees of asymmetry, degrees of fusion, separation, degrees of articulation.
But topologically, okay,
that's the kind of world
let's take the shell out of the discussion, because I could make an argument just for laughs that you could do the same thing with an orthogonal piece.
You can't.
Which has substantial variability. It wouldn't be literally the same.
No, it wouldn't.
Well, okay,
it wouldn't
if
be.
that's not so, what would be the difference between doing it orthogonally and doing it with a series of shells?
Doing it orthogonally don't give you the variation, giving the nuance, the suppleness, and it has less degrees of freedom, less parameters to play with, and it will create white noise in the end. If you try to increase complexity with orthogonal systems, you generate white noise.
Did you try it with orthogonal systems? In other words,
Yeah.
if I said, look, I tried it with pyramids, I tried it with boxes.
It's a good point.
Hang on, let me just get it. I tried it with this, I tried it with this, I tried it with this. Didn't work, and now I got, by your logic, I arrived at a solution. I didn't jump to a solution, which would be the instinct argument, which is not your argument. So in other words, you've arrived at this having eliminated other possibilities. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, you're quite correct, yeah.
So we could look at...
Let's say I'm saying curvilinearity is superior with respect to the agenda of increasing complexity and order at the same time in a built environment compared to straights and corners. Because as you try to enrich and diversify these kind of straights and corners fall into a kind of kaleidoscopic, meaningless noise. The curved surface, and shells are part of it, has the advantage, first of all, you know that on one side it's concave, on the other convex, so you know whether you're in or out with respect to a territory which matters. You can see at the degree of curvature, the size of the space can be read off of the local condition and degree of curvature, etc., etc. So when you start intersecting two curved blobs, the intersecting element recognizes itself as something unique with two curves and two points. If you intersect rectangles, produce another rectangle, which you don't know is that rectangle an intersection.
Okay,
how big are the circles which sponsor the intersection?
Let me give it back to you.
So there's far less information.
I understand what you're saying. I don't know if it's so. You could make well, hang on. We'll see if we can work it out. Maybe we can't. That the orthogonal condition offers you something. You're saying the curve has this kind of fluidity. You're in, you're out, it's concave, convex, and all of that. On the other hand, the corner or the orthogonal offers you what you're calling, offers you a place to hide. It's very different being in the corner than it is along the perimeter. So you make a very particular distinction, which is different. Then I didn't say it was better, but it offers you another option which your system doesn't allow.
No, we do allow creases and corners, but you can't do everything with them. If you make too many of these, the whole thing fragments into white noise.
But you understand what I'm saying?
You can't express continuities across multiple territories, but with a kind of...
But you're enunciating this as an operational principle, and all I'm saying is I think there's some substantial exceptions that your system doesn't allow. So it's not altogether clear, at least to me, that the process of going forward, or what you would call progress, would mean the curve is ipso facto superior in terms of gradients and options and so on than the straight line. I don't know that.
It's not only the curve, and I'd say the classics had the curve, but they had always the arc, which had a kind of stiff radius all the way through, and it was usually a full circle or semicircle and so on. And to some extent, these conditions of the classical and of the modern are absorbed as moments in a much wider spectrum of opportunities, where we've liberated the curve off the arc into continuously varying radius. The corner appears as the kind of smallest or
right.
zero.
Let me just
zero
go back to this. Maybe the curiosity point isn't as good. There's another research, a kind of research. Let's take Columbus. Okay? And Columbus, somebody says the earth is flat. And somebody says if you sail in this direction, you show up in India. So it turned out it wasn't flat, and he didn't show up in India. Okay? The question really, and this is what I'm looking for, because I think research, what I'm concerned about is that your research ratifies itself, that the operational principle you start with is the conclusion you finish with, and that research in an open sense or in a free sense would, I tried to throw that Hitchens thing at you, have to admit the possibility it might go elsewhere. Does it ever do that? Not in a technical way.
Yes, it did in the 80s. Where we didn't know where we're going, and everything was up for grasp and thrown up in the air. Architecture, in its institution, established principles and canons were bankrupt, and characters as yourself and Wolf were the great mutants and experimenters, which experimenting this way, you didn't know where you were going. You were just kind of ripping through and following intuitions and making and producing opportunity stuff. But there has been, since a selection process out of this, where we're not throwing everything up in the air every year anew, but we're kind of selecting, reproducing, and making kind of now secondary fine-tuning mutations, selection, reproducing, and we're advancing, we're moving from revolutionary research, let's say, and the revolutionary condition and research into cumulative research. And cumulative research, you still have moments of, I guess, uncertainty, but framed, part of a trajectory, where you know that you have strategic aims and agendas, and within that you move forward. So in this sense, I kind of no longer find it so helpful, that gesture of disruption, of putting the wrench into and
no, but I think you're attributing
stopping a trajectory.
You're attributing.
From scratch.
I understand the point, and maybe it's a fair point. But I think you're attributing a kind of psychotherapeutic motive to a point of view in architecture, and I'm raising a completely different question. Research, in an open sense, didn't end in the 80s. It didn't. So as long as there are things you don't know, you have to be prepared for the possibility that it might be other than what you think. And my sense is not that it wouldn't be worth it to, in a narrower way, I could say, look, I walked around Mexico, in Mexico City, I looked at Candela, fascinating guy, doing in a kind of instinctive way and in a crude way, but in a powerful way, a lot of the things that you're dealing with now in a more methodological way. And I could, it seems to me, this would be my argument, I don't think it would be your argument, that you gain and you lose. It's not that what you're doing is necessarily better than Candela. It has a different kind of meaning. And because it might be going from the Villa Savoy to Richard Meyer, and some people have said there are some architects who do Le Corbusier better than Le Corbusier, which is probably, you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, well, let me try to bring in this point again. The openness of research is not a virtue per se. there are moments of crisis where research has to totally open up, and then you have to kind of narrow it down again. So I was rolling around on the floor doing body prints and frottage and splashing ink and all sorts of things in the 80s, right? And then in the late 80s and early 90s, we discovered computational tools, and we toyed around them, just produced random computational stuff, right? But out of this, in the early 90s, we started to get a glimpse that this kind of, but we knew that we were aiming for, we had that lust for complexity, and we knew whatever we do, we had to create richness, complexity, the differentiation, and out of that came then something which we kind of hooked onto, the idea of continuously differentiated fields. At that time, we were reading philosophy. 5 years later, we were reading strategic software manuals and
can you tell us who you mean by
to validate and redeem that openness research and to close it down into a cumulative trajectory which delivers something after 10 years, 15 years, which we're onto that.
Wait a minute. Who is we?
We is all of us here, I guess.
Or
half of us here.
No, not me. No, this is interesting in terms of a kind of political. Are you speaking for your firm? Are you speaking for history? Or who are you?
Myself and Shajay and Tom and Wolf and.
Well, my guess is some of these. But do you admit that the question is a plausible question? Because when you talk about where you think thin shell research is going, you obligate everyone to acknowledge that there was a certain kind of obstreperous rolling around on the floor, which ended in 1980. Therefore, anybody who's rolling around on the floor now has psychotherapeutic problems, and the real issues of architectural research are somewhere else.
No,
this is what you're saying.
The difference is historical. It's not biographical. I mean,
well, I think it's biographical.
It's historical because today we don't have the Wolf Prixes and Zaha Hadids, right? And
right, you mean, do I agree?
No.
Right,
because
you mean...
the new cast of characters required. Now we have a whole generation of young architects moving in concert, in a convergence, picking up the results of 15 years of cumulative research. They have to skill up, they have to learn and build, and then build on top of that. They're not starting from scratch. Like they're not standing on the ruins of a bankrupt discipline. They're building on a kind of discipline in full swing. I think it was.
But you're not. If you listen, Patrick, if you play this back to yourself and you listen, the guy who is the biggest advocate for democracy in architecture, but you're going to deliver democracy in your terms. I mean, if somebody...
I'm saying it's a lot of people. Maybe we can hand over to Shajay. I want to see how he sees how strategic the research is, how disciplined reading scientific papers, or how much openness and
But look, I'm not saying there aren't scientific papers, whatever that may mean. We were listening to the debate last night, and one guy had a scientific paper, and the other guy had another scientific paper. I'm not sure exactly what that would, if that would prove your case. I think there was a conception that a radical point of view in architecture would suggest an exception to the homogenization of rules. In the same way, I think we talked about this in the AA. If you look at what Hitchcock and Johnson did, for instance, at the end of the 20s, and they made an exhibition. And, hang on, and they said, this is the way you do it. If you want to be a radical architect, this is the roof line, this is the structure, this is the glazing, this is the graphics. That's the way it's done.
You're making a caricature out of them, but I support this effort. I think that was a necessary step after 10 years of research to take stock, canonize, systematize, and bring onto explicit principle what had evolved and kind of gone through an internal selection process, and then to roll out in America, to roll out all over the world, under with the confidence of learning the lessons of a decade of research, experimentation, and early manifesto projects, to take the stock, formulate principle, some kind of canonization, and then roll out to make an impact.
The vocabulary is fascinating. What do you mean by canonization? You know who gets canonized? That's what the Catholic Church does when somebody turns water into mojito or something. I mean, what are you talking about?
What I'm talking about is that the exceptional achievement, which Kipnis was talking yesterday about, aren't you doing it, I'm interested in the exception and the exceptional achievement. It's like the exceptional achievement is only an exceptional achievement which has the capacity to become the new rule. It deserves to be emulated and is...
And what follows from that?
It's transformative. It's not, if it remains the exception, I'm not interested anymore. I'm interested in exceptions which become exceptional, exemplary, paradigmatic achievement.
So therefore,
which sponsor a new movement.
Okay, but then they can't be an exception to your rule, is what you're saying.
No, they become rules.
Because
the exception transmutes into a rule.
Yeah, but there is no
avant-garde.
But wait a minute. Okay, but there is no rule that I know of, whether it's the Oedipus complex, or whether it's Marx or Hegel, or whether it's John Maynard Keynes, or whoever formulated, because it's always interesting to think whether those rules are extrinsically so, whether they're empirically so, or whether they're inventions coming out of an imagination, which you could argue Oedipus and Electra, maybe not. Maybe Jung had it right, or Adler, or whatever Prozac they're giving this week.
Let's stay with architecture. And I'm saying that the rules which I've been trying to formulate or make explicit and formalize, which are called the rules of parametricism, the formal and functional heuristics of parametricism, they are not my invention. They have evolved through kind of 15 years of collective work, discourse, debate, experimentation, selection, reproduction, cumulative research, and looking back on this with an analytic eye and a systematizing eye, you can condense rules. And there should have been rules because it's quite a coherent, and you can see that,
well, let me ask
coherent collective movement.
Let me try
which follows principles which can be analytically retrieved and made explicit.
So let me try it in a different way. Do you think if we were to build that shell or that combination of shells, and a sociological obligation of the construction. We should talk about the scale at some point, because I think nobody knows whether it's a scale model or a literal model or what the scale implies in terms of, but at some scale, the question is whether that conception would admit a contradiction. In other words, within the system, that shell structure, because you're talking about a kind of continuity that the shell can't accommodate, because that's my house, and I want to, in the shell you're building for me, I want to go sit in the corner, okay? And the question is, when you make your shell, or conceptually when you work, can the work contain an opposition which contradicts the first principle of the content of the work. I give you an example. Wolf said it to me today, and it's a great example, and he made a very ugly drawing on a napkin. It's great. And he showed the Barca coach, the football team or the soccer team in American terms, triangulating the movement of players down the field, almost all the players. Then he made a different, utterly contradictory system, which both sides accommodate. Here comes Lionel Messi, doing something entirely different. And I thought this was actually a fascinating kind of diagram. I don't think it's dated, actually. I think the question is, can the shell structure or any of these kind of consistent, homogeneous, going forward lockstep accommodate Lionel Messi?
Yes.
Or, yeah. So in the context of this, meaning if the shell had to make an exception within the linguistics of the shell, how would you do that?
Well, because these are parametric systems, and they inherently should be inherently capable of absorbing shocks, singularities, interruptions, other entities which come into them, not just by remaining indifferent or being kind of blown holes through by them, but by kind of absorbing them through deformation, correlation, action-reaction rules.
Does it illustrate that? Does he exhibit?
No, it doesn't illustrate that. But
it illustrates the opposite.
But the paradox here is that you want to give me a kind of disruption and an irritation, and I'm saying the irritation and disruption is absorbed through a new rule. So that
No. There are no rules for Messi. That's exactly the point.
I don't want Messi.
I know,
but
you can't keep him out of the game. You can't keep him out of the game.
Because the heuristics is that every disruption becomes, is absorbed with the reaction and becomes part of an information.
Then you're saying you're going to make him behave.
They behave in yeah. I think that's the creative act. The creative act, your creative act.
From his point of view.
Your creative act is to throw something at the shells, right?
No, I explained to you very precisely. The coach is making this okay. And now we made it. This is not throwing something.
Okay.
It's integrating, but in two very different linguistic forms.
Yeah.
So nobody's rolling on the floor.
No. I agree with you 100%. What I'm demanding is, or been proposing, is in parametricism to move from a single system approach, only shells over shells and everything out of shells, for instance, or everything a single undulating surface zone, to a multi-system approach where the ontology of the different systems which come together should and could be as radically diverse as possible, in fact. So I don't want to necessarily add to one array of shells a kind of another internal shell, but throw something rather different.
Could you drop a box in the shell?
You could, and then the shell, but then I would ask for another step of absorption, integration, action, reaction, where this new kind of set of boxes, for instance, resonates with the shells adapt, the boxes kind of adapt to the shells, and then there's a kind of...
But why do they have to resonate? You were talking about Mahler last night, okay? So this or Cage, or Bartok, or you can go all the way back. What do you mean by resonate? And when you say resonate, doesn't that prescribe only a certain way of making music?
Yeah, it's a heuristics where I'm saying something is made to resonate, so that you invent some kind of associative logic, some kind of adaptive process which allows the system A to be sensitive to what system B does, and vice versa. So that's the way we work. That's the way we can we can have multiple ontologically radically different systems, nevertheless being correlated and become nearly representations of each other, so that you can feel where the cube has moved in because the shell is shifting over.
So you can't accommodate an adversarial relationship in that pro forma. What you do is you hold hands.
Yeah.
You never.
Well, you could maybe once or twice you can just blow something in, but how many times can you do that without the whole thing disintegrating into visual chaos?
That's why they call it design. I mean, that's a different discussion, but how many? But we're just trying to understand whether you admit, yes, for instance, yes. Look, let's take the project down the hall. Why is it necessary to see from the, there's a walkway, Patrick, on the second floor, and you can look down. And actually, interestingly enough, you showed the other day, if you look from there, you see one thing. If you look from there, you see another thing. You look from, in a way, that's true. In a different way, you're seeing manifestations of the same thing. I don't want to pick on the boxes too much, but why is the inside and the outside essentially descriptively the same? Because if the conditions you're accommodating belong to the city or to the street, or to, so then why are they repeated internally?
Shouldn't necessarily. We actually had the idea to put ribs in this. Yeah. Well, it's an ambition. We're trying a number of shells, and we've been modeling, and Shajay developed a computational process of ribbing shells in elegant and structurally meaningful ways. So we had the idea of ribbing the inside on some shells, on the outside on other shells of the ensemble. So yeah. I mean,
but this is
it's not meant to be the same.
This is the next level of discussion. But if the object appeared very differently, I don't want to go to the worst architect who ever lived, but Palladio or somebody like that, and that we have to learn. But when you put pieces together, the exterior of the building, the configuration, whatever it's addressing, is very different in shape-wise and space-wise from the interior for very prosaic, banal, conventional reasons. So the question is, for those same prosaic, banal, conventional reasons, aren't we limiting the versatility of the shell by obligating that it become both an extroverted form and an introverted form when the extroverted obligations are entirely different? And if you simply do IIT architecture building and say, okay, you can put the structure outside, you can put the structure inside, a rib system inside, a rib system outside, you could do that. I'm talking about something which is more substantial than that what would be represented externally wouldn't belong to the family of shells whatsoever. And does the research admit the capacity of the shell system? In other words, is it shells or I quit? Or are there ways of manifesting a very different adversarial, not adversarial in the sense not that it would disrupt your resonance, but for very different obligations? I want to hide in the corner. Will you allow me to do that or not?
No.
I know that.
No, of course I would.
You're fired.
No, just to say, I mean, of course, yeah, you could have that. You're talking about the Venturi Porche, where the exterior and
don't give that to Venturi. This is the caves of Lascaux. This is an old idea, okay? It's not Venturi.
I mean, I accept that there are different obligations and different agendas with respect to exterior and interior. But I think there's also a point to be made about transparency from exterior to interior, that the exterior gives you a hint, an expectation, and a chance to navigate into the interior and find what you were looking for, is also not a bad argument. But I also accept yours, and in fact, I understand it to be Venturi's, that the facade is contributing to an urban space as much and perhaps more than it is also contributing to a much smaller interior space. Mm. So these two constraints or tasks, obligations, mean that the different inside and outside morphologies are radically different,
and something,
and they're absorbed
something
in
between.
They're absorbed in the Porsche, in a sense.
And isn't it fair to say that the insistence on the replication of the shell also develops an insular kind of strategy, that it segregates as much as it integrates? Could be used that way. So it could be used in a divisive way, not in the way that you're always very generous and very democratic and everybody likes that. But the question is whether that system delivers that.
I think there's I'm thinking usually of a whole range where they kind of separate fully, to separate half, to separate a quarter, to separate very little, and bleed into an openness. So I think I'm always interested in a spectrum, a range, not only a simple dichotomy, open-closed, but everything in between. So that's the kind of thinking. Something in terms of the paradigm and style we're working in, we're always looking for more degrees of freedom, more parameters to open up, to vary. Then we're looking for, as we create systems with elements, more differentiation, multiple simultaneous differentiation in different directions. And then we're also looking, because we're never having a single system, we're looking at resonance and correlations with other subsystems which are themselves differentiated according to their logic, but start to adapt to each other and recognize it as
let me ask you something related to that.
And all that leads to a highly organized and intricately structured environment which you can navigate, which is legible, which structures social discourse on a new, nuanced and complex level, which isn't just for 3 hours we're in room A, then we move over into room B, and we have a second experience. No, I'm thinking of an environment where I have 15, 20, 25 experience flowing into each other, where I'm gathering and meeting and bringing different audiences into synergy in different conditions, because the environment orders them.
Let me ask you,
and so on and so forth.
Let me ask you something about that, which I know what the answer is, but I think the question's worth asking anyway. To what extent do you think the argument you're making to what extent do you think it belongs to a particular culture, or that that is to say there are a number of cultures which you may or may not want to acknowledge, and I want to say it's one global culture. Assuming there are different cultures that historically have produced different ways of thinking, I mean, it seems to me to make a huge caricature that the resonance argument might, for reasons very different than yours, be more sympathetic in the East than it is in the West.
No, I don't believe that there's regional, that cultural differences are geographic anymore, and to the extent to which there still are, that's receding fast. Although I believe that we're living in a world society and world culture on many levels, there are different cultures more than ever. There's a rich differentiation of cultures, but for me they're linked to the world division of labor. So I'm thinking more the difference between young startups firms in the IT industry as one culture.
Let me explain to you, Patrick, what I'm saying.
Wait, let me finish this. It's very important. Another culture is the financial industry and bankers and business people. There's a totally different culture. Another culture is art students. They're quite different from engineering students. But they are world spanning. So an art student in Beijing is very similar to an art student in Bombay and London and New York. And a young banker or a middle-aged banker.
I think, look,
so these are the cultures which we need to cater for.
For a student of history, I mean, we brought the guy who runs the Tsinghua University here to teach, and anybody who thinks that the cultures resonate or are synonymous is at least leaving out a few things. What I wonder is the process, the intellectual, cultural, developmental process that belongs to the West. industrialization. Hang on, it's just oxygen.
It's a false,
and
false category.
Wait a minute, okay. And what some people call the Enlightenment, Locke, Montesquieu, American Declaration of Independence, whatever it is, as a way of thinking, and as a way of thinking of people individuated, not always in a collective way. And in Eastern cultures, which offer very different things, the West never produced Lao Tzu. It never produced a guy who went around talking about a square with no corners. There are different cultures and different cultural inheritances. And therefore, the meaning of your arguments in one part of the world might be very different in the Arabic world, or in the East, or in the West.
That's fading very fast. I wouldn't want to overemphasize this. As I said, I think...
I recommend a very good book to you by a guy, Harvard guy who just died. His name's Samuel Huntington. So if Patrick doesn't have time to read it, hang on, we're getting to it. And the book is called The Clash of Civilizations. And the guy is a controversial guy, and there's been a lot of discussion about this. And essentially his argument is that the 21st century is not an extension of the 20th, but a rerun of the 19th in many fundamental ways. I didn't say it was true, but it's not to be dismissed as if, what are you talking about? It's a guy who's written a series of books dealing with this subject, and it's not only what is going on in the Balkans, or what happens, for instance, when the Japanese, the Koreans, the Philippines, the Taiwanese, and the Chinese are arguing about a piece of rock in the ocean and are ready to shoot each other over it. I'm not saying this is what will happen or should happen, or that there aren't contradictory propositions. But it seems to me that in so many of these cases that the difficulty is in insisting that there are no legitimate differentiations at different points of view. If your point of view relies on this kind of homogeneity, consistency of a kind of international culture of banks and museums, it's not that it's not so, but it's certainly not entirely so. And to admit the contradiction affects the way you think about what you do. And to dismiss the contradiction, it seems to me, affects what you do.
And I've been more into kind of the always already hybridity of world culture, where the West has integrated elements of, from the Arabic world, from China, through centuries, always already hybridity. I'm saying that not only because it's true, but also to not disenfranchise other regions which want to fully participate in world culture on the most advanced level. And I'm looking at China, and a lot of Chinese students and Asian students are here. What gets in the way is this kind of obsession with the kind of Chineseness and the difference. At the same time, they want to kind of fully participate in world civilization. And that's what they should be doing. And if there is certain so-called Eastern cultural features of collectivism, of tighter family conditions and so on, there are atavism and residues, not of original Chinese culture, but of a different era. So I think we have socioeconomic systems and stages produce culture. So feudalism in the Middle Ages of Europe produces very similar social structures and modes of communication and philosophies than feudal China. And an industrialized Fordist society produces in different regions, working class cultures which are similar in many ways. So, and I don't believe that's regional or deep historical. I think it's to do with the world division of labor, and there's a richness and differentiation. I think it's extremely important to look at it this way, and that there is a world science, a world engineering, a global best practice for the financial systems and money systems, and there is also a world architecture which everybody participates, and the contributions coming from Japan, coming from Beijing, coming from Iran, Tehran, and everybody is equally interjecting and participating, and I think that I believe that to the extent that there are regional cultural differences, there are atavisms, if anything.
You know,
they're holding, and if people kind of internalize and fetishize those, they become barriers.
Yeah, but you have to be careful not to assign pejorative terms to points of view that aren't yours. Meaning, Samuel L.P. Huntington is fetishizing the Balkans. He's not fetishizing the Balkans. The Catholics and the Greek Orthodox and Islam have been going after each other for quite a while. That's not news to anybody. And as far as I can tell, it's not necessarily going away. That doesn't mean when cultures share, I mean, one of the famous examples, don't want to go too far in this, is 11th century Spain. And you could see the Catholics, some of them, not Torquemada, came later, but the Catholics and the Jews and Islam working in a kind of composite culture, but each contributed something. Difference, wait a minute, difference is not a pejorative term, and homogeneity is not ipso facto a virtue.
I think
the difference, the better argument would be build on the differences, don't deny they exist.
Well, we have to look at, we shouldn't fetishize them, let's say. Most probably, individual styles, for instance, are based on individual limitations. Individual conditions are, I think there is the Soviets tried to have their own biology, kind of communist science.
Wait a minute, so did the Republicans.
And I feel
it's America.
Well, I'm saying this because I believe architecture is world architecture. Parametricism is the global epochal style, and it gets in the way if the idea that, well, we shouldn't, in certain regions, China, which has a lot of kind of a nationalist sentiment and chip on in terms of trying to be wanting to catch up, fully participate, yet wanting to be different.
Okay,
therefore it gets in the way.
China has a history.
When there's a barrier to full-on and leading participation because you want to maintain Chineseness, and that is kind of
no. You're attributing motives.
Japan,
I don't want to retain. As a matter of fact, I think people who have looked at China historically, there is no Chineseness anyway. There are very substantial differences between Islam and the West, the northern guys, the southern guys, there are all sorts of differences. And over millennia, China has been plural, Chinas. Russia is the same, okay? So these historic differences, and when you pull the pieces together, you can do a better job if you acknowledge the differences and the similarities, as opposed to denying or assigning a kind of pejorative, conservative stigmata to doing it.
I just don't care where the contribution comes from.
Nobody
the most sophisticated,
You're not defending democracy.
And in fact, I find that
we're just talking about
China
the reality of the reception of an architectural strategy which might in fact be read differently in North Africa than South Africa. And if you're the guy that is bringing a kind of socialization or new social possibilities, the thin shells you're making probably mean something different in Zambia than they do in the Philippines.
But it's not the difference between the Filipino and the Zambian, it's the difference between ways
of seeing, ways of thinking, ways of believing, ways of understanding. Everybody doesn't understand everything in the same way.
Different locations, positions in the world division of labor. So, whether your contribution is the extraction of raw material and mining with certain levels of capitalization and degrees of technology, or whether your contribution is...
Yeah, well, come on, Patrick.
I think
some people think you get to the what's in the mine by cutting off the top of the hill. Some people think that. Other people who value what's in the mine differently. And the different strategies. One might be, give me the dinero, and one might be, hang on to the environment. And you could, let me go to one more subject, which interests me. It's a little bit different than what we've talked about. In former times, as I think they say in Vienna, constructivism, the history of constructivism, was a, let's say, inspiration or motivating factor in what you guys are doing. Is it still? Is it still?
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, no problem. You know, I remember when you used to say, in America, when somebody says no problem, it means big problem. Yeah, if the supposition is wrong, then you should say so. But in the developmental stages of your practice, Russian constructivism was, let's say, an inspirational, a foundation, a premise, whatever you want to call it. So the question is it still a premise? Is it still a frame of reference? If it isn't, what replaced it, or what's the surrogate?
Well, there are other, Fray Otto, for instance, as well as what he stands for, namely the kind of analogical source domain of natural processes and systems of self-organization in the inorganic and organic natural environment. These are kind of source domains and inspirations.
He's an engineer.
And things to emulate, plus things like related to that, which allows us to see nature in a new way, namely complexity theory. Of course, computer science and the whole research paradigms around artificial intelligence, artificial life. These are sources of inspiration.
But those are pieces of what I mean. This is what I mean, and maybe I need to elaborate a little bit. The constructivism argument as a hypothesis has to do with Malevich saying the new man, okay? So we all looked at images of the new man. It's a sociological argument. It has to do with the optimism that the culture would be different. It would be motivated by very different things. For instance, those guys didn't think that there was an international banking system that everybody agreed to that was viable. They thought that was a sickness, and we should dispense with it. So if you say that constructivism and its social and political objectives in the service of Vesnin brothers and so everybody's favorite Shukov towers and so on, and now those guys and those motives and those social purposes, which seems to me, at least in some cases, are enduring purposes, even in terms of your priorities. But now you're saying that's not the inspiration anymore, and the new inspiration is Fray Otto. Did I get that right?
Well, you need to distinguish the constructivists in terms of the explosion of formal possibilities and three-dimensional construction in space, of unheard of radicality and ephemera and lightness and so on. That was, of course, very powerful. Which and the contribution of abstract art for the formation of modern architecture and design is is to be recognized. At the same time, you have a generation of architects who had new social purposes, but they were not their social purposes. These were the new social possibilities of a society which has gone through a First World War where an old order collapsed, and social revolutions took place in Russia, Germany, Poland, and elsewhere. And this was mandating and challenging the discipline of architecture and brought on a totally new cast of characters, because the heroes of modern architecture weren't architects, they weren't educated as architects. It was a totally new cast of character, a refoundation of the discipline, but the political agenda wasn't developed by architects, qua architects, is something which is a much larger force which they adapted to. And saw the need to make architecture congenial with. Not only saw the need, they had to do it. Somebody had to do it, and whoever did it was succeeding and became the new
But
generation.
they had to deliver it as a city, as a form, as a space, as a sociology. This was their job.
Absolutely, but the point here I'm trying to make is that
I mean, if you deliver a bank, that doesn't mean you're the guy who belongs to the banking system, somebody else, and you're delivering it. So the fact that an architect delivers an ideal or a strategy doesn't mean the architect is obligated to be the inventor of that strategy. All I'm saying is, it seems like the motivation of
the social purposes of the modernists didn't originate with them as architects. These were the purposes of the Weimar Republic, right? These were the purposes of the early Soviet Union. So you shouldn't attribute that to Gropius and Mies and Hannes Meyer. You should attribute it to a whole social process which is much larger. So then again, now looking at today,
yeah, but wait a minute.
We are obligated
hold on half a second. Because this is a little bit unfair. If those were the purposes of the Soviet Union, why did they build none of this work to speak of? I mean, literally. Obviously, the purposes, but the purposes of the Soviet Union in a governmental sense seem to be very different than the ideals of the people who you followed. And what was exceptional about those people is that they looked for something that actually, notwithstanding the arguments, the theoretical arguments, the society turned its back on, or the government turned its back on.
But you want to ask me why I'm not a social revolutionary at the moment, right?
No. I don't think what they're talking about is a social revolution. I think they were talking about a way of looking at the interrelationship of people and institutions.
And exactly that's what we should do. So I'm taking my lead.
So that's not done. We're not done with that.
I'm saying I've been working on, for the last 10, 15 years anyway, and with more urgency now than ever, to burden parametricism and that new wave of architectural design research with the social purposes of and agendas and challenges of what I call the knowledge society, the post-Fordist network society.
And what's the source of that agenda?
The social transformation processes and socioeconomic restructuring processes we've been living through the last 20 years.
But more specifically, I mean, is it Romney's America? Is it what?
No,
I mean, is it Sarkozy's France?
It's Google's America. Google's America. It's
yeah. Did you see how Google behaved in China? Which Google are you talking about? They walked away, but not first they signed and then later they walked away. That's Google.
Well, let's say it's the Silicon Valley up. It's all of our productivity and ways of working, and the kind of life processes we need to have facilitated by a built environment. I mean, all those participants in advanced economies, in innovation, research, development, intensely communicating, updating, recalibrating what we're doing, what everybody else is doing. All of what we need, what the people working and living and being super productive in Silicon Valley need, include also what Wall Street and the City of London needs, what the West End media companies need. And they need something quite different.
Ping pong tables and buffet lunches.
They need something very different from what the auto workers of Detroit needed 50 years ago. And that
there aren't very many auto workers now.
That needs to show in a different architecture. And that's why parametricism, what we're doing, looks different from what Gropius was doing in the 1950s.
I don't know if it looks different or not. So this is another discussion. Anyway,
so a new society needs a new architecture, and
that's what the Russians said.
Exactly.
Exactly what the Russians said. And the mistake the Russians made is it didn't realize that their aspiration.
Do you believe that the new society needs a new architecture?
I don't know that we have a new, that's a good question. I think new aspects of our society need to manifest themselves in very different ways.
And how?
Not in a conventional way, exactly. But not by ignoring the fact that some things don't change, some things are changing, and the art of doing what you're talking about is to know where the changes are taking place and where consistency is part of a kind of human condition. The other thing I would say is the distinctions between people. You know, when you talk about crowds, and this is quite fascinating, and the research you guys are doing is great, but in a way, sometimes we talk here about architecture, one architect at a time. And if you talk about a crowd, the way Canetti talks about crowds, where crowds, and there are a lot of cultures, not to say Nuremberg and things like that, where crowds are manipulated and the individuality of the people is dismissed. And I think this is a perpetual danger. I would say Google has as much capacity to be a disaster as it has capacity to be marvelous. And the fact of the matter is that it is both simultaneously. Contradiction is intrinsic to delivering what comes next, not denying it. This would be my argument.
Is there any questions from the floor? Or contributions,
or the ceiling?
interjections, or?
And yeah, sure. Yeah,
on what?
Hi. I would like to hear a little bit about the connection or the disconnection between the parametricism and the actual methodology of building it. Because what I see on the screen, besides the magnificent, the renderings that you show, is the most amateur, to say the least, methods. Like there's a plywood module like there's staples, there's tape, there's glue. I mean, where is this research taking us? How can we make this, how is this going to change the world? I mean, we're back to like people failing. It's still the same problem.
Can you teach them where the sophistication lies?
Well, I mean, I think personally for us, like when we did, the sophistication is in like collaborating with people who know, like, and sophistication is in being able to transfer that knowledge from one set of people at the craft level to bring it to something that we can all collectively share as professionals. Like even with just the resin, or this process of construction, there's a lot of craft involved, and that just realizing that is to us is a kind of sophistication, because then you can do speculate further on where it can go, like knowing how craft level things work, and in a way, like at least to me personally, like I see that learning in a collective, that's how it can go forward, like by learning the little details and speculating further on.
I mean, but it's also mutual, because they have never done this process. It's a process which is radically new to them.
like what about that was done by Eames? Well, I mean, no, like what? Well, I mean,
you don't have to defend it.
Yes, I think so. Like if it is like a research prototype where you, by collaborating and getting people together with like diverse knowledges, you identify key areas of synergy, and then that, of course, it will lead to going forward. I mean, I don't. To me, it seems like it's a given. Like if people with different skill sets and knowledge come together, it has to produce a better hybrid. I mean, that is the sophistication, I think. Like, at least that's what we want to go.
Anybody? One
it's
more.
Not the shape.
We have to. Do you have some food here? Yeah. Okay. So Stephanie is hungry, so we have to.
Do we have time for one more question, or
we have to. Okay. Let me just thank. I mean, Patrik has sat here for 3 days. I mean, he can take a punch. He can throw a punch. Listening to Jeff and Hernan and Wolf and others, and I think Hernan said this the other night, that people should understand, and it's important to understand, we're colleagues, we're friends, we see things sometimes in a different way. It's worth saying this, that the differences, I mean, sometimes you beat up more on your friends, and I think we know this, and maybe this is a social law, and ignore the real villains. So in that doesn't mean anybody is taking anything back, but it's important to understand the context in which the discussion takes place. In this venue, and we've had some other discussions in some other venues, and then hopefully it leads to a greater sharing and understanding and all of the good democratic things that Patrik supports. So, and his architecture confirms. So, no, I don't say that facetiously. So thank you very much for coming and hanging in for 3 days, and thanks very much to Patrik and his staff, and thank you.